Hello, Danielle.
Hi, Gatica.
How are you doing?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm excited to speak to you.
Oh, my goodness. Thanks to you for sharing your expertise on the subject and sharing all the experiences. We will hear about that too during our interview. My very first question about 17 years back, Danielle, when I was working on television in Toronto, and I wanted to, it was exciting for me to know that I could join a board. I could just whatever I have interest in, I'm passionate about. I could just go and contact that organization and say, guys, I'm interested in volunteering my time and do something for the organization. So I remember my first day entering a boardroom and my first meeting, and it seemed to me I was the youngest in the room. And then I talked about it with friends and colleagues, and this is the definition I realized what they were saying was board of directors. The definition is group of retired, high profile individuals who have finance, management, accounting, numbers, finance, accounting, management, numbers, experience. They play golf and they show up for the quarterly meetings. So I need to know how much has the definition changed in last 2 decades or 15 years?
Yes, so I share that experience. I have definitely been the youngest person in the room on more than one occasion. I think we maybe have had that conversation outside of this session. And it's changed and it hasn't. So there's a lot of trends happening in corporate Canada that obviously spill over into not-for-profits, which are by the definition corporations as well. So things like wanting to have more diverse voices at the table and an understanding that the more diverse a group is, the more likely they are to make good decisions. And there's good data out there about that is driving some trends that we're seeing affecting the boardroom. So, formally, the government of Canada has the 50-30 challenge, which is a challenge to boards to have 50% women and 30% visible minorities. And that is partially driving this idea. The other thing we're seeing is activist investors. So, on the for profit, publicly traded side of the house, we are seeing large corporations, pension plans, those sorts of folks actually driving boards to become more diverse in a recognition of the risk that exists by having eight golf playing old accountants sitting around a table. You're not getting that diverse perspective. That being said, in reality, it's been a slow uptake. So you could very well walk into a boardroom tomorrow and find it very similar to what you experienced 15 or 20 years ago. But at the same time, you could actually walk into a boardroom tomorrow and find that that organization, either through outside influence, already having had a reputational issue that could have been managed by more diverse voices, already starting to move to that more diverse in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of background, both professional and sort of ethnic cultural. And I would also say it is very hard to be the first person in the room. It's not that you shouldn't do it, but you really have to feel that in your core. And if you're not feeling that in your core, you really do actually want to be maybe looking for a room where you're not the first person to hold that kind of position, because that's very challenging to do while you're also trying to learn how to be a good director.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's important to be the first person. First step is important, but then also you're in the learning process, so you kind of it's a difficult match. But then again, Danielle, I'm kind of debating that in my head as I listen to you. Having seniority, seniors, people who've had that experience with that organization for like decades is so important, right? But what you're saying, I think, is that just those kind of representatives on the board or in the room is not uh, ideal right now. So go ahead. Like people like digital transformation, right? We need to
There's
know
a
about.
there's
Sorry,
a
go ahead.
balance, Monica. There's a balance. So it is important to have, and by the way, you also have staff in the room, right?
Mhm.
Um, it is important to have somebody in the room who understands how you got to where you are and what decisions were made that went well or didn't go well.
Mhm.
The flip side of that is this is the way we've always done it is incredibly dangerous. And I think where I heard you going was also on the digital side, right? And so if you take, for example, a tech company, most tech companies have younger folks on their board
Yeah.
because if somebody shows up at a meeting, and I use a lot of paper, but if somebody shows up at, an IT company's board meeting with a stack of paper, that's a really bad sign. And so yes, there's a push and pull and a balance to be felt for sure.
So how important is it, the digital transformation?
It's incredibly important, and it's incredibly important from two perspectives. One is the obvious one, which is competitiveness, right? We live in what, in particular in the not for profit industry, we talk about as the Amazon generation. So I can go online and in one click get something delivered to my house tomorrow. So when somebody interacts with your organization with that level of expectation in mind, the people around the table have to have an appreciation of that gap. The second reason for this is risk related. So cyber risk is a growing issue. And while you can obtain insurance for it, it's important that board members understand and manage for and ensure that the staff are managing for cyber risk.
So regardless of the board,
Mhm.
what are the key positions? And also tell me why are these key positions, their roles and responsibilities are so important for that person to be aware of?
Right. So, from a legal perspective, a board can be as small as three people. Um, that being said, the sweet spot right now is around 12. So you get diverse perspectives, but not so many people that it's onerous. The key positions on a board are somebody who's chairing the board. So that could be the chair, the president, oh goodness, there's a whole host of titles that person might hold. And then in addition to that, you need somebody who is the secretary treasurer, and that might be a combined role or separate roles. But the treasurer piece is somebody who's got their eyes on the money, digging deeper than maybe what the board itself is looking at and able to help report back to the board and focus the way the staff are talking about money. And then the secretary role, which is very important from a governance perspective, because that's the record keeping piece. So are you keeping minutes? Are you notifying your members, stakeholders, shareholders of your meetings in a timely manner? Are you meeting all of your sort of legal reporting obligations to government entities and agencies? And so those are the three core positions. However, a number of boards are choosing to recognize these emerging risks like cyber risk by delegating some of the more day-to-day oversight to those individuals.
How about fundraising and a few other titles that are popping up? I notice in job titles and on the board websites as well. How important are those? Sometimes people think, oh, maybe my president can be the fundraiser as well, or maybe my secretary can be the fundraiser as well. So that's why I want to know, like, why are these important roles, and they need to distinguish between them and the responsibility.
So it depends on the organization, right? It depends on a couple things. So I like to say there is a spectrum of how mature an organization is from a governance perspective, and that is unrelated to how old the organization is. So maturity from a governance perspective is that the board has sufficient resources and a culture of governing as opposed to operating. So in an organization where the board is governing, and the expression that's used is nose in, fingers out, right? So you're paying attention, but you're not fussing with
Managing
it.
it. Okay.
Those sorts of organizations, the sorts of titles you're going to find on the board are going to be a lot more high level than in an organization with a working board or a board that the organization has so few resources that the volunteers are required to do administrative and operational functions. In those organizations, you will often see a lot more sort of operational titles that would otherwise exist inside your staff complement.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No. And so, to your question about fundraising specifically, so that would be a charity or some other not for profit. And in that case, the fundraising director might be anybody from somebody with a lot of fundraising experience to whom a high functioning board has delegated oversight of the fundraising function within the organization, all the way down to an organization with little to no staff resources where the director of fundraising is actually doing fundraising. So they're actually, writing copy or in charge of the fundraising database or something of that nature. And then there's a spectrum between those two positions that's more or less based on the nature of the organization.
So, as a new board member, I'm
Mhm.
thinking it becomes a little bit challenging to say, oh, I want to know more about this area of the organization or your company or your firm. So, as you said, you're not there as a manager, but you're sitting on the board. You're responsible for lots of important things. So, what are the right ways to ask to know more about an organization so you don't kind of sound bossy or you're trying to manage people there because you basically there for your strategy, right? Helping them figure out things and direct them in certain things. So what are the right questions and what are not the right questions to ask?
Sure. So I think that at its core, as a board member, you have a fiduciary responsibility to the organization. That's a big word, but basically what it means, and there's a legal term, that you are required to act as a reasonably prudent person. And so you are required to satisfy yourself that legal, strategic, and financial obligations are being met by the organization. And in that box, there's a lot of room in terms of what you can ask for. So, first and foremost, you want to be getting the information you need to act as, again, a reasonably prudent person. And for some people, based on their education and experience, that's not going to be very much information. For other people, that's going to be a lot more information. And what you need to understand is that as a group, you are collectively liable for the organization being a going concern. And that means that you can and should and are obligated to continue to ask questions until you are comfortable with the answers. And boards can't, I mean, you have to keep in consideration the amount of resources available because you're also responsible for the financial health of an organization. But you can go up to and including looking for outside validation. So, an outside accountant, an outside HR person, a lawyer, those sorts, consultants, anybody you need to satisfy yourself that the organization is going, um, generally speaking, in the direction the board is setting for the organization. So you are managing for ensuring that the direction you are giving is actually what's happening.
So the other question I wanted to ask you is what is the difference between the board of directors, board of governors, board of trustees? It's kind of overlapping, sometimes confusing, and too much information for people. Can you make it very simple for us to understand?
Right. So generally speaking, it's all semantics. There are a couple exceptions, but by and large, those three terms mean the same thing. Often, the reason that one term is being used over another is either historical, it is related to comparable organizations. So, in academia, you often see universities having a board of governors or a board of trustees, but they're really just doing the same thing that a board of directors is doing, which is governing the organization. That being said, you don't see the word trustee in publicly traded companies. You tend to see it in foundations, private corporations, and something like a charity where monies are held in trust on behalf of the public. But beyond that, they're very interchangeable, but people are very passionate about which one they are. Don't ever try to tell a governor that they're really just a director. They're going to be very offended.
Okay, good point. For those of us who are listening to the podcast and trying to join a board in 2024, but don't know where to start, first of all, I think what they want to hear from you is how can they become board ready or match up to the board capital of the organization they're looking into?
Yes, so that's going to depend across organizations, obviously. I mean, I have the training to sit on the board of a publicly traded company, but because I work in the not for profit sector, there would be a lot more education that I personally would have to take on. So I would say I'm incredibly biased because I hold one of these designations, but I really feel like the Directors College at McMaster, which issues the Chartered Director Designation, and the Institute of Corporate Directors, which issues the ICDD, are best in class in terms of education. They're both Canadian organizations that were founded about 20 years ago in recognition of the fact that people were sitting at board tables terribly underqualified. And we've seen cases of that across the globe, but I think the Enron scandal was the biggest one in terms of these were incredibly smart, educated people that were not doing their fiduciary responsibility to a financial institution that had its tendrils into a large part of the economy. And so I would say education's a big one. Both of the courses I just mentioned are incredibly expensive. So there's two ways to also look for education. One is by joining a board that will pay for that education. So one of the boards I sit on actually requires of its directors that they take at least the not-for-profit portion of the Institute of Corporate Directors education within 2 years of being appointed to the board, and the organization pays for that. But you can also get sort of informal education. And when I go back to the point I made earlier about those sort of mature organizations in terms of governance, looking for a board like that to sit on is going to help you raise that level of knowledge and skills. I think the other piece is being honest about what your knowledge and skills are. There is a drastic difference between the vice president of a major bank and somebody who's been a bookkeeper for a year and a half. They both have financial knowledge, but the extent of that knowledge is very different. And so boards are starting to look at the skills mix on their board, so back to the diversity issue, and are starting to measure that. And so being board ready is bringing your authentic self and your knowledge to the table, but also being willing to learn what it takes to be a good director. There are a lot of books out there in the corporate sector, a lot of textbooks that are used in some of the courses I mentioned. There's a fantastic, really easy read book called The Imperfect Board Member that I would recommend if you're looking for just the really high level of how to kind of upskill yourself and put yourself in the right frame of mind. So I hope that answers your question
Yeah,
in terms
that
of
that was
how to
really good.
board.
Thank you so much.
Right,
Actually, I was going to ask you a follow-up question. Like after our interview is done, I'm sure lots of people will
yeah,
take out a paper and a pen and say, okay, this is what I'm interested in. This is what I'm passionate about. And I've been thinking about joining a board. But what are the top 5 things I really need to focus on in the next 1 week or 10 days so that I can start
right,
reaching out to those organizations? So tell me
right.
the top 3 or 5 things.
Sure. So, top 3 or 5 things, self assessment. It's all about self assessment. So, who am I? What do I care about? What do I know? How much time do I have? Right? And how many resources do I have? Because some boards, particularly in the charitable sector, there's an expression give, get, or get off, right? And so some boards actually have a sort of floor for how much you either have to donate or raise. So it's a lot about the self assessment of who am I and what do I have available to myself. And then the secondary thing, Geetika, to your point about passion is what do I care about? Because there is nothing more boring than sitting in a board meeting for 90 minutes for an organization where you could care less what happens, right? So, what are my interests? What are the industries I already know something about or I want to learn more about?
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was a lot of information. And I'm hopeful that people who will listen to our podcast will reach out to the places that they want to work for, give back to the community, and spend some time doing something important outside their job.
Absolutely. And I will say this from the not for profit sector side Volunteer Canada, which is an umbrella group, obviously, of volunteer based organizations in the country, issued a alert last fall that we have a volunteer crisis in Canada. So we have significantly more need for volunteers than we have people stepping up to fill roles. So despite the fact that I have sort of come down the mountain a little bit on being the big bad wolf in terms of making sure that you are qualified to be sitting at the table, I also want to encourage people to really kind of take that risk and take that on because we really are in a time and a place in history where volunteers are incredibly critical to our social fabric and infrastructure.
Well, as you just said before as well, that first step is important. So take that, right? Thank you
Absolutely.
again. Take care, and we'll have lots of topics. I think I'm so curious about your book. Maybe that would be another topic and podcast for our viewers to listen to. Thank you, Danielle.
Okay.
Bye bye.